Let's go ahead and start that 30-second countdown. The Subcommittee on National Parks, Forests, and Public Lands will come to order. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on 10 National Park Service bills. Under Committee Rule 4, subparagraph F, any oral opening statements at hearings are limited to the chair and the ranking minority member or their designees. This will allow us to hear from our witnesses sooner and help members keep to their schedules. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they're submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. today or at the close of the hearing, whichever comes first. Without objection, the chair may also declare a recess subject to the call of the chair. I also ask unanimous consent that Representative Steve Cohen join the hearing to ask questions of the witnesses. As described in the notice, statements, documents, or motions must be submitted to the electronic repository at hnrcdocs@mailhouse.gov. Members physically present should provide a hard copy for staff to distribute by email. Please note that the members are responsible for their own microphones. As with our fully in-person meetings, members can be muted by staff only to avoid inadvertent background noise. And finally, members or witnesses experiencing technical problems should inform committee staff immediately. I'll go ahead and start by recognizing myself for a brief opening statement. I want to thank the sponsoring members of Congress as well as our witnesses for joining us today to speak about the personal and national significance of these proposals. Today's hearing will be an impactful reflection on American history and on who we commemorate, the places that we commemorate, heroic acts and important parts of American history that we look forward to commemorating by virtue of the legislation that's been proposed by the members who will testify today. I am not going to go through all of these bills because we have a very full agenda today, and I know that we also have floor votes this morning, unfortunately. So I will just simply say that in addition to hearing about bills to regulate commercial filming on public lands, honor the nation's first Holocaust memorial, designate new memorials in Washington, D.C. to recognize the contributions of service animals, Thomas Paine, and esteemed French diplomat Jean Monnet. We will also hear today about a number of bills designed to increase various representation in terms of memorials within the national park system, and certainly very excited about hearing all of those bills today. So with that, again, want to thank the sponsoring members of Congress. This committee has endeavored very much to be a bipartisan committee. Proud that we have Republican members and Democratic members with their proposals today, and that we, working with the minority, have been working very hard to ensure that any member in our body who introduces a public lands bill gets an opportunity to come before this committee and to make their case on behalf of their constituents in their states. That's ultimately what this is all about. So with that, I will yield back my time and recognize the ranking member for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and duly noted. There are some Republican-led bills on today's docket, and very, very thankful for that. And that's how I wanted to open up my statement, by acknowledging there's 3 of the 10 bills today that are Republican-led. And my bill, the Film Act, is one of those, and that would cut unnecessary bureaucratic red tape and support the First Amendment rights of citizens on federal lands by streamlining the cumbersome film permitting process. This legislation will help grow our outdoor recreation economy by showcasing all of the wonder and beauty of of our federal lands, including the beautiful lands of my home state of Idaho and those in the chairman's beautiful state of Colorado. Mr. Chairman, thank you also for including bills from my colleagues, Mr. Wenstrup and Mr. Buck, in today's hearing. I think we're going to hear from Mr. Wenstrup here in just a minute. Although I'm pleased that these bills will be discussed today, I can't help but think we still are missing some of the forest for the trees, with no pun intended. One more of the pressing concerns of our constituents back home. While back in Idaho over the last couple of weeks, I heard from many constituents that were concerned or remain concerned about the threat of wildfires in our state and around the West in particular. This is a threat to homes, recreational areas, and businesses still, and it's growing. Since we met last on June 23, less than a month ago, the number of acres burned in the United States has increased from 3.2 million to 5 million acres, nearly 55% increase just within that last month. 2 days ago, we reached the ominous mark of 5 million acres faster than we have any year of the previous decade. In fact, this amount is over double the 10-year average, which stands at roughly 2.5 million acres. What's perhaps most concerning is that we're just now entering the hottest part of the summer. Now, in this current trajectory, 2022 will be, or could be, the worst wildfire season on record. So committee Republicans are committed to confronting our out-of-control wildfire crisis by introducing legislation to aid the Forest Service and other federal land management agencies in increasing the pace and scale of active forest management. We're also holding 2 forums over the next 2 weeks focused on the topic of wildfire. On Friday, we will hold a forum on saving our sequoias, which are currently burning in the Washburn Fire in Yosemite National Park. These fires are burning so intensely, they're shooting large sequoia branches hundreds of feet in the air, nearly colliding with fire suppression aircraft. Next week, we'll be discussing the real-life impacts the wildfire crisis has had on millions of Americans because of lack of active forest management, from destroyed businesses and homes to wildlife habitat reduced to ash. The consequences of letting those infernos rage out of control year after year are almost too difficult to speak about. We owe it to our citizens in the West to turn the tide and start proactively managing our lands. And as a subcommittee, we can't continue to ignore the real and significant risks wildfires are posing. I introduce legislation like the Film Act to help ensure constituents can fully enjoy our federal lands, but don't want a camera lens fogged with smoke or family pictures coated in the haze of wildfire. We can't truly enjoy our federal lands unless we start to care for them or properly care for them, and I hope our committee will do just that. I thank you, each of the witnesses here today, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I thank the ranking member. Now I'd like to turn to our witnesses. Before introducing them, I'll remind non-administration witnesses that they are encouraged to participate in the witness survey diversity survey created by the Congressional Office of Diversity and Inclusion. They may refer to their hearing invitation materials for further information. The chair will now begin with recognizing member testimony. We're going to start with the gentlewoman from the District of Columbia, Ms. Norton, if she is available virtually.
Thank you, Chair Neguse, for hearing me on the Francis G. Newlands Memorial Removal Act, which I co-introduced with Congressman Jamie Raskin. The bill would remove the plaque and inscriptions bearing Francis Newland's name from Chevy Chase Circle, a federal park located both in the District of Columbia and Maryland. I'm pleased Senators Chris Van Hollen and Ben Cardin have introduced the companion bill. Newlands was a U.S. Senator from Nevada and the founder of the Chevy Chase Land Company, which developed the Chevy Chase neighborhoods in D.C. and Maryland. Newlands was also a segregationist. He built Connecticut Avenue and ran a streetcar up the road to newly built Chevy Chase Lake. However, homes on Connecticut Avenue were purposefully priced to keep working families out, and covenants were later added to many of the property deeds in Chevy Chase, explicitly prohibiting the land from ever being owned by African Americans or Jews. These covenants have since been declared void. Newlands went further to keep Black and white Americans separate. In the late 1880s, he and Senator William Stewart secured 2,000 acres of land for Rock Creek Park. Establishing this park not only increased the property values for landowners like Newlands and Stewart, but also kept white communities distinct from emerging Black communities on what they call the, quote, wrong side of the park.
Love it.
Newland's racist views went even further. In 1912, he called for the repeal of the 15th Amendment, which gave African Americans the right to vote.
Well, how do we do this? I mean,
The gentlelady will suspend. For those who are virtually, if you could mute your microphones, including the non-administration witnesses, the non-member witnesses. The gentlewoman is recognized. Ms. Norton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The fountain was established in 1932 by Congress. In 1990, the Chevy Chase Land Company also added a plaque next to the fountain. A resolution to remove Newland's name from the fountain was first introduced by the DC Chevy Chase Advisory Neighborhood Commission in 2014. On July 27, 2020, the commission voted unanimously to ask the National Park Service to remove the plaque bearing Newland's name and to begin discussion on a new name for the fountain. This bill would remove Newland's name from the fountain and remove the plaque entirely. Newlands does not deserve to be honored on federal land. And again, I thank you for this hearing, Mr. Chair.
Gentlelady yields back. We thank you, Ms. Norton, for appearing today. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania, Ms. Wild, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me begin by thanking you and the members of this committee on both sides of the aisle for taking up this bill, the National Service Animals Memorial Act. I want to especially recognize my colleagues on this committee who have co-sponsored the bill, as well as the colleagues in both chambers who have made the bill both bipartisan and bicameral. Congresswoman Mace of South Carolina, Senator Blumenthal of Connecticut, and Senator Blackburn of Tennessee. This bill brings us together across geographic and partisan lines because it reminds us of bonds we hold in common as Americans. From the fight for our independence during the Revolutionary War to every military engagement we have taken since, animals have played a pivotal role in protecting and sustaining our service members in combat. Over the course of our longest war, the war in Afghanistan, military working dogs saved countless lives by detecting improvised explosive devices on patrols. While these contributions alone are heroic, service animals' contributions extend far beyond combat. They serve veterans when they come home after serving our nation, providing vital everyday assistance and helping mend the physical and invisible wounds of war. They serve civilians with disabilities and mental health challenges, and they are indispensable to search and rescue missions in the aftermath of large-scale disasters and when individuals go missing, particularly the most vulnerable members of our society, such as children and senior citizens. This bill would finally provide official national recognition of the legacy of service animals and their handlers by establishing a commemorative memorial to mark their service and sacrifices. The establishment of the memorial would be fully paid for by a partner organization and with no federal funds eligible to be used. I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support this bill resoundingly. I look forward to working with you all to continue moving it through the process and all the way to passage. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back and thank you.
Gentlewoman yields back. We thank you, Ms. Wild, for introducing your bill and being with us today. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Wenstrup, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Neguse and Ranking Member Fulcher, for holding this hearing today. I'm grateful that the committee is considering my legislation, H.R. 6799, the John P. Parker House Study Act. I want to take a moment to share with you John Parker's story and his contributions to the Underground Railroad and abolitionist movement. His legacy is a deserving part of our rich American history to be preserved and shared as part of the national park system. John Parker was born into slavery and bought his freedom in 1845. Establishing himself in Ripley, Ohio, he became a renowned African-American entrepreneur, foundry owner, and inventor with several patents to his name. At night, he acted as an extractor for the Underground Railroad, risking his life and livelihood to sneak into Kentucky and help more than 500 freedom seekers cross the Ohio River and onto their path to freedom. If you visit his home, it is extremely moving to stand by his home and atop the hill that looks out over the Ohio River, and really get the image of the bravery and the challenges that was faced for those that participated in the Underground Railroad to come across the Ohio River at night and to do it under the cloak of night. And I'm sure to many people that his home was to them their Statue of Liberty at that time. Sadly, during the 1900s, Parker's story was lost, and his house on Front Street, where he lived until his death in 1900, was left to fall to pieces and crumbling.
Yeah, I signed in. On my video shot, I'm visibly on the shot.
Mr. Cohen, if you could mute your video for a minute, we're going to recognize you in a minute. Thank you.
Things began to change when the John P. Parker Historical Society was founded in 1993. Led by President Carol Stivers, who you will hear from later today, the society was able to raise funds to buy the house, which they did in 1996. I cannot compliment Mrs. Stivers enough for her leadership and service to our community in championing John Parker's legacy for future generations. We would not have a house to preserve if it were not for Carol and her amazing team of volunteers. In part because of their work, the John P. Parker House was made a National Historic Landmark in 1997, and in 2002, it opened its doors to the public. Despite the success of the John P. Parker Historical Society so far, its members are concerned about its long-term sustainability and believe that we should evaluate whether federal management through the National Park Service is the best path forward so that this historical treasure is properly cared for years to come. The National Park Service has already completed a reconnaissance survey of the Parker House, which determined that the site likely meets the suitability and feasibility requirements, while also recommending that a special resource study be completed to definitively answer those questions and evaluate all possible management alternatives, including federal ownership through the National Park Service. H.R. 6799 would do exactly that by requiring the National Park Service to determine whether or not the Parker House should be designated as a unit of the National Park System. So thank you once again, Chairman and Ranking Member, for considering this legislation. I hope all members of the committee will join me in supporting H.R. 6799 to ensure that generations to come can learn about the incredible legacy of John P. Parker through visiting his home in Ripley, Ohio. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Thank you, Mr. Wenstrup, for your bill and for being with us today. The chair will now recognize the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I apologize to Mr. Chavez. I thought I was not even on, so I was obviously on. And I apologize.
No apology necessary. No apology necessary. Good to have you here with us.
I appreciate the bill that he was promoting, and I hope that that does become law. And we have a bill to require that sites that were lynching sites in the South be recognized as well. Lynching happened mostly in the South, and they were ways that Southerners who were not satisfied with the results of the Civil War and liked the post-Reconstruction segregation that that Plessy versus Ferguson brought to us and that put into law by the Supreme Court at that time, used to have their own sense of justice and to be judge, jury, and executioner. And they took people and they executed them as terrorism, white terrorism, throughout the South for many years. Some of it happened in my hometown of Memphis and my county of Shelby County. There are sites where we know where people were lynched, and it was illegal and wrong. And there's an area in Montgomery where they've got a lynching museum, in essence, a site where lynching horror is brought to the fore and people can visit and realize what happened. I went to an exhibit at a museum in New York in the meatpacking district. I forget the name of the museum now, but they had an exhibit of black and white photographs that were prominent, particularly in Europe, more than the United States, of lynchings, people being lynched from trees, African Americans being lynched. The idea that that was what Europeans saw of America and not what Americans saw of America was very disturbing. And it continues to disturb to this day. And until we remind people of our past, and we will not overcome it, and we will not have a better society. We need to recognize the errors in our past. We are not a perfect society. We are, according to our Constitution, trying to become a more perfect union. And that needs to happen. And what we did to African Americans, what we did in allowing slavery, what we did to wiping out the Native Americans and murdering many of them and taking their land, and what has happened needs to be taught so that we understand that America, while a great country, and I still think the greatest country on earth, not necessarily the freest country on earth after this Supreme Court, but still the greatest, what America's past has been and how we need to overcome it. With that, I thank Mr. Watkins, who's going to be a witness today, who's from my hometown. I'm proud that he's with us today, and I look forward to his testimony and the passage of this legislation. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Thank you, Mr. Cohen, for being with us today and for introducing your legislation. The chair will now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Ruiz, for 5 minutes. All right. Well, I believe Mr. Ruiz might have a competing engagement, and so he will join us shortly. But in the interim, we will proceed to our panel two, second panel. I want to thank again the members of Congress for testifying, and would ask our second panel to proceed to the dais.
We do have Miss Brown, actually. I'm sorry.
Where?
Chantel.
Oh, what bill? Oh, my apologies. My apologies. I have made a big error. Oh, yeah, that's right. We have one more witness, one more member witness, one of our newer members of Congress, and we're privileged to have her join us today. And I, for whatever reason, the agenda here did not list her. So the chair will now recognize the distinguished gentlewoman from Ohio, Ms. Brown, for 5 minutes. We thank you for being here, and you're recognized.
Years ago. Located in Bedford Heights, Ohio, the memorial honors the 6 million Jewish victims of the Nazi regime and its allies and collaborators. Notably, at the foot of the memorial lies 6 coffins filled with the mementos of their loved ones and ashes from the death camps of Europe. Since then, survivors and their families have continuously cared for what is likely the oldest memorial of its kind in the United States. Given its historical significance, the Cole Israel Memorial deserves to be recognized by Congress. Designating this site as a national memorial ensures that future generations understand the true legacy of this dark chapter in history and reminds us that we must stand against rising anti-Semitism today. This legislation comes at no cost to taxpayers and does not establish the memorial as a unit of the National Park Service. The Cole Israel Foundation will retain the oversight and responsibility for the memorial as it has for 6 decades. On May 11th, 2022, the Senate Energy and Natural Resources National Park Subcommittee held a legislative hearing on the Senate companion measure, which Senator Sherrod Brown and Rob Portman led. Additionally, members of my community, the Ohio Governor, the Ohio General Assembly, and prominent local and national stakeholders like the Jewish Federation of Cleveland, the Anti-Defamation League, and the American Jewish Committee have all endorsed H.R. 7618. As the representative serving Ohio's 11th Congressional District, I am honored to represent our district's celebrated Jewish community. Each person and every victim has their own story. Now is our opportunity to honor the victims of the Holocaust who call this country home and to remember their bravery, heroism, and everlasting legacy. I thank the committee for taking swift action on H.R. 7618 on a bipartisan basis. And with that, I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. The chair thanks the gentlewoman again for introducing this legislation and for being with us today. And certainly the committee looks forward to working with you to make sure we get this to the floor. So thank you again for being here. The chair will now recognize Mr. Ruiz from the state of California for 5 minutes. We're glad you could join us. Mr. Ruiz, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to everybody on the committee for allowing me to appear before you today. It is a great pleasure to be here to testify in support of my legislation, the Cesar E. Chavez and the Farmworker Movement National Historical Park Act. This legislation is so important to me personally because of my deep connection with, and my community's deep connection with Cesar Chavez and the Farmworker Movement that he led. You see, I grew up in the barrios of Coachella, California, a resource-poor farm worker community. My parents were farm workers who toiled in the fields day in and day out with minimal rest and calloused hands and tired backs to give us, my brother, my sister, and I, a better life and opportunities that they never had. I remember seeing Cesar Chavez organize our parents after school at our local Coachella Valley High School, and I remember the hope that he brought to the people I knew, to my family, la esperanza para todos los trabajadores agrícolas, the hope to all the farm workers. In fact, I remember hearing of the first contract signing victory of farm workers in my district, in Coachella actually, in the 1970s. His dedication to improving the lives of farm workers and their families in the Coachella Valley and across the nation was an inspiration to the nation, inspiration to the world. Every day, he inspired me to give back to the community that had given so much to me. In college, at UCLA, and later at Harvard Medical School, I had a poster over my dorm room bed, and it was a picture of him hung on the wall, and it read, on it read his quote. It said, "The end of all education should surely be service to others." That was my motivation then. It's still my motivation now. And that is the reason why I introduced this legislation with Senator Padilla, so we can tell his story so that future generations may come to know it and be inspired as well. Our bill will create the Cesar Chavez and the Farmworker Movement National Historic Park and the Farmworker Peregrinación National Historic Trail. This legislation will expand the current Cesar Chavez National Monument, La Nuestra Señora Reina de la Paz in Keene, California, to 2 new additional sites. These sites were carefully chosen from the 2013 National Park Service Special Resource Study, which recommended that Congress establish a National Historic Park with sites significant to the life of Cesar Chavez. And each piece of this national park and trail would tell a piece of his story and the farm worker movement he pioneered. The proposed national park includes the 40 acres in Delano, California, which was the first permanent headquarters of the United Farm Workers of America. The national park includes the Santa Rita Center in Phoenix, Arizona, where Cesar Chavez fasted for 24 days to protest the state of Arizona's legislation that limited farm workers' rights during harvest season. And the legislation creates a national historic trail, the Farmworker Peregrinación National Historic Trail, based on the 1966 march from Delano to Sacramento, where farm workers marched for 300 miles for better conditions and a fairer contract. These sites are critical to tell Cesar Chavez's story, the story of everyone who worked to ensure better conditions and stronger rights for farm workers, and the story that inspired millions of people. However, this legislation does more than simply tell the story of Cesar Chavez and the farm worker movement. Too few national parks tell the story of women, minority groups, or other marginalized groups. Yet these groups made America the country it is today, and these groups helped create the American dream for so many of us. The National Park Service is America's storyteller, and the stories it tells should reflect the diversity and beauty of our country. My bill will help bring us closer to this by telling the story of Cesar Chavez and everyone who worked to improve the lives of farm workers. With that, I thank you for inviting me here today, and I urge swift consideration of my bill. Si se puede.
The gentleman yields back. The chair thanks the gentleman for being here for the committee, or in front of the committee rather, and for introducing his legislation, which I certainly strongly support. The chair will now thank the sponsoring members of the legislation that we are considering today, and transition to the second panel. As with the first panel, oral statements are limited to 5 minutes, but your entire statements will be made part of the hearing record. When you begin, the timer will start. It'll turn orange when you have 1 minute remaining and red when your time has expired. The chair now recognizes Ms. Kim Hall, National Capital Regional Director at the National Park Service. Ms. Hall, you are recognized.
Good morning, everyone. Chair Neguse, Ranking Member Fulcher, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to present the Department of the Interior's views on the 10 bills on today's agenda. I would like to submit our full statements for the record and summarize the department's views. H.R. 1256 would direct the Secretary of the Interior to remove the brass plaque and concrete block bearing the name of Francis Newlands from the grounds of the Memorial Fountain located at Chevy Chase Circle in the District of Columbia. The department supports the goal of legislation and would like to work with the committee and the sponsor on issues of implementation if the committee decides to move forward with the bill. H.R. 6353 would authorize the National Service Animals Monument Corporation to establish a commemorative work in the District of Columbia to commemorate the heroic deeds and sacrifices of service animals and handlers of service animals in the United States. The department supports this bill. H.R. 6438 would authorize the Secretary of the Interior to conduct a special resource study of the site known as Deerfield in the state of Colorado to determine the suitability and feasibility of establishing this site as a unit of the National Park System. Deerfield was the largest and most successful Black homesteading settlement in Colorado. The department supports this legislation. H.R. 6611 would authorize the Embassy of France in Washington, D.C. to establish a commemorative work in the District of Columbia to honor the extraordinary contributions of Jean Monnet. The department appreciates the significance of Monet's works, but recommends that the committee defer action on H.R. 6611 until after the National Capital Memorial Advisory Commission reviews this proposal, which is currently scheduled for July 27th. H.R. 6720 would authorize the Thomas Paine Association to establish a commemorative work in the District of Columbia. The department appreciates the significance of Thomas Paine's influential writings during the American Revolution era, but recommends that the committee defer action on this legislation until the National Capital Memorial Advisory Commission reviews this proposal, which is also scheduled for July 27th. H.R. 6799 would direct the Secretary of the Interior to conduct a special resource study of the John P. Parker House in Ripley, Ohio, to determine the suitability and feasibility of establishing this site as a unit of the National Park System. As a conductor on the Underground Railroad, John P. Parker helped runaway slaves escape to freedom across the Ohio River. The department supports H.R. 6799 with an amendment. H.R. 7618 would designate the Cole Israel Foundation Holocaust Memorial in Bedford Heights, Ohio, as a national memorial. The department does not have a position on this bill, as the memorial would not be located at a site that is under the jurisdiction of the Department of the Interior, and the bill does not provide for any management or funding by the National Park Service. H.R. 7912 would authorize the Secretary of the Interior to conduct a special resource study to determine the suitability and feasibility of establishing a network of locations associated with lynchings in the vicinity of Memphis, Tennessee, as a unit of the National Park System. The department supports the goal of increasing public understanding of the history of lynching and other incidents of racial violence against Black communities that would appreciate the opportunity to work with the bill sponsor to better understand the scope and context of the proposal. H.R. 8046 would establish the Cesar A. Chavez and Farmworker Movement National Historical Park, which would include the existing national monument in Keene, California, the 40-acre site in Delano, California, and the Santa Rita Center in Phoenix, Arizona. It would authorize the Secretary of the Interior to add McDonald Hall in San Jose, California, and other representative sites to the park. The bill would also designate the Farmworkers Peregrinacion National Historical Trail. The department supports this bill with amendments. H.R. 8258 would provide exceptions from permitting and fee requirements for content creation, regardless of distribution platform, including still photography, digital or analog video, and digital or analog audio recordings activities conducted on land under the jurisdiction of the Secretary of Agriculture and the Secretary of the Interior. There is currently litigation surrounding filming in national parks pending before the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District Circuit. Once a decision is rendered, the department would like to work with the committee and bill sponsor to consider legislation or other approaches to balance the interests and rights of those engaged in filming, photography, and audio recording activities with the government's interest in protecting lands and resources. Chair Neguse, this concludes my statement, and I would be pleased to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Ms. Hall, for your valuable testimony, reminding the members that Committee Rule 3, subparagraph D, imposes a 5-minute limit on questions. The chair will now recognize members for any questions they may wish to ask the witnesses. The chairman. All right, the chair will now recognize the distinguished chairman of the full committee, who continues to make the state of Arizona and our country proud, Chairman Grijalva.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, I should just not even ask the question now. Let me, Ms. Hall, the establishment of the Cesar Chavez United Farmworker National Historic Park is, you know, one of the points that was made, and I want to applaud Chairman Neguse and the ranking member, because before their committee is, at least in the Park Service, and there's been a real effort on the part of this committee, and they should be applauded for that, for beginning to tell the full story of the American experience and American history through our parks, public lands, and our public assets. And the Chavez is one of them, and Mr. Cohen's is another, the Holocaust Remembrance is another, and the list goes on. And I think that's a good thing. And so, but on the Chavez thing, following that train of thought, how do you think that it helps further that goal?
Representative Grijalva, thank you so much for that question. The National Historical Park that is proposed would include a number of sites around California and Phoenix, as we outlined in the testimony and as you know in the bill. The goals of this current administration, and certainly of the National Park Service and the Secretary of the Interior, are to tell broader stories across the United States, things that may not have been brought forward in our country's history in a more meaningful way, so that a variety of people can connect to those stories. For us, this is an opportunity to take these various sites, certainly support their designation within a National Historical Park, and be able to work with either our current National Park Service staff that is working at the monument and/or our partners that we may engage with on the additional sites or the trail that would be added, to be able to make this story more available to any number of people through that partnership.
Thank you. And before I yield back, Chairman, I think our colleague, Mr. Reese, spoke to the issue of the legislation and said everything that needed to be said about the importance of the man and the movement. But I just want to say that in terms of telling the story, that this designation goes beyond Cesar's legacy and the farm worker movement. That is the center of it. That is the crux of the legacy and the story. But I think what he represented to communities across this country, in urban Tucson, in urban Chicago, and other places all along, the presence and the symbolism that he brought is hugely important historically. And I think you'll find that on this site, that's the reaction you're going to get. It's an acknowledgement of current history and the impact that it had within a very short period of time. And growing up in that epoch, it was transformational. And so it's a very important one, and I appreciate the Park Service's work on it, and Mr. Chairman, certainly appreciate your leadership on it, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and I certainly agree with the chairman. The chair will now recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Hall, thanks for your testimony, for being here today. I've got a couple things I'd just like to run past you. First of all, there are some people that believe that the bill that I'm sponsoring called the Film Act will prioritize filmmakers over public use and access, and it could lead to resource damage and destruction. However, it's my understanding that the interim guidelines that the National Park Service has put in place following the DC Circuit Court ruling in the case Price versus Barr, they're nearly identical to the provisions in my bill. So I would just like to get your input, please. Has the Park Service interim guidance on filming led to any increased resource destruction or damage that you're aware of?
Ranking Member Fulcher, thank you very much for that question. I'm not aware that there has been any specific categorization or collection of information regarding that particular issue. I'd be happy to take that question back to our agency and see if we could get you a more detailed answer, but I don't have any awareness directly at this time to be able to share.
None that you're aware of at this point? And,
None.
and if you
Correct.
would follow through with that would be helpful. So
Oh, yes,
please
I
do.
would be happy to
Okay.
do that, sir.
Thank you. Can you share with the committee any challenges you've come across that you're aware of that the National Park Service is experiencing, if any, in complying with the ruling on Price versus Barr? And that, once again, held that the permit and fee requirements applying to commercial filming on federal lands are unconstitutional under the First Amendment. Any challenges that you or the Park Service have identified in complying?
I am not specifically aware of any challenges, but there are a number of people who have management oversight and legal oversight of this issue within our organization. So I would love the opportunity to bring that question more fully back to folks who have a little more detail in the complexities of this and the interim guidelines and how they're being applied, and happy to share those answers back with you.
As we go through the legislative process, it's important for us to know and to understand that and just see a full understanding of what we're dealing with. So please do that if you would, and we'll follow up
Absolutely.
too.
Happy to do that, sir.
Shifting gears a little bit, HR 8046 would establish the Cesar Chavez and Farmworker Movement National Historical Park, which frankly, in my view, is a worthy monument to put in place. No issue with that whatsoever. It does take approximately 155 acres and add to the national park system, which is to me and to many of my colleagues is a separate issue. That's 155 acres more that goes into the federal estate. And coming from a state that's dominated by federal lands and knowing the backlog on all the unattended areas in that regard, could the department identify another 155 acres somewhere else that are not currently meeting the needs of the Park Service that could be recommended for disposal to offset the 155 that would be coming in to the federal estate?
Thank you very much for that question. I'm not aware that the bill would require that all of the acreage come into the system. The National Park Service has a portion of this legislated area in a national monument right now that we manage. Currently, we propose looking at the additional sites that would be added through a cooperative management situation where partners or other entities may be able to operate those in conjunction with the National Park Service, but that we wouldn't necessarily be required to acquire those lands. And we would certainly look at whether that would be appropriate down the road or into the future under some other model. But we are certainly open to the idea of doing things through partnerships so that additional lands don't have to be added to the
Ms.
Park
Hall,
Service.
and thank you for that. The overriding issue that I'm trying to point out and hopefully drive home with the Park Service is as things are added to the federal estate, to please consider an offset to that. And so that's the overriding issue. No issue at all with the monument. That's just it's a mindset that I would like to foster throughout my time on this committee and the subcommittee, and something that I'm hoping to communicate and have that type of mindset into the culture of the Park Service as well. So please consider that in your role, okay?
Absolutely.
Moving on again, and I am just out of time. I could go for another 5 or 10 minutes, Mr. Chairman. I'm out of time. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Cohen, if he's still with us virtually.
Thank you. I am Mr. Neguston, and I appreciate it. Ms. Hall, you said that you wanted to discuss a little bit additional about the evaluating lynching sites for inclusion in the National Park Service bill that I have, that really Mr. Richard Watkins was the original source of and inspired me and encouraged me to introduce. I'm willing to talk with you at any time about what you're thinking, and I imagine Mr. Watkins would be as well, and we'd like to do that. Indeed, Brian Stevenson has done a great job with the museum in Montgomery, the National Peace and Justice Center. But what happened to L. Parsons in Memphis, and I was at the dedication of a marker there that the local historical commission put up, it was just unbelievably egregious. He was burned alive. 3,000 people there, white people were there to watch it and cheer it on. And those type of astonishing past horrific incidences in our society need to be brought to the attention of people to know what did occur, what it was like for African Americans to live in this country for 100 years after the Civil War, give or take, and the horrendous incidents that happened. And as I said, it was the Whitney Museum that I saw this photographic exhibit. Europeans knew more about it than North Americans in the 20s and 30s, and maybe even to this day. So I'll meet with you and look forward to doing that. Memphis is where Dr. King was killed, a kind of a lynching of 1966 and 60s. But this was would be part of what people should be exposed to understand that the past in our nation's history. And if you want to elucidate upon what you're interested in, I'd be happy to respond or listen and learn.
Thank you, Representative. For the National Park Service, our goal is to be as thoughtful as we can as we proceed through the idea of creating new sites and identifying new areas that might be brought into the National Park Service. We'd love the opportunity to work with you and your staff and any other sponsors to think about how comprehensive we need to be in our look at this. There are a number of sites related to racial violence around our country. And so our goal certainly is to support the idea of connecting more people to these really traumatic and violent parts of our history, but to validate what's happened in our past and then consider if there are additional sites that also qualify that might want to be added within the scope of this bill. So we appreciate that opportunity, and we'll certainly loop back with you and work with you on the content of that.
Thank you, Ms. Hall. Last year, Danny Davis and I passed a bill to recognize Mr. Julius Rosenwald for what he did in the South to help with education of African-American children who were not being allowed public education the way they should. And that was passed, and we've got some Rosenwald centers, schools being preserved, and hopefully we'll do the same thing with lynching sites. And I thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes Mr. Moore for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Ms. Hall, for joining us today. I appreciate the work that my friend and colleague, Mr. Fulcher, who continues to make Arizona and our nation such an amazing place to, as he tries to modernize the outdated film and photography permitting process and making it easier for more people to access and enjoy our public lands. It's a shared goal of ours and definitely a worthy endeavor. A couple questions, Ms. Hall. Efforts to modernize the way government programs or fee structures operate are important. Are you aware of any other programs under the purview of the National Park Service that are in need of modernization?
Thank you for that question, Representative.
And we only have 5 minutes because I'm sure there's plenty.
Right. Thank you. Well, I think our agency, I work with a lot of very experienced colleagues who run a number of programs within our organization that serve us both internally and externally with the public. I think we're always looking for ways to modernize and streamline and be better at the work that we do. Sometimes it's brought to our attention and we're able to respond to it accordingly. Sometimes we are fortunate enough to be able to identify those needs for enhancements or streamlining on our own. Certainly, if anyone has particular options they'd like to bring to our attention, we'll be happy to work on streamlining those things.
A number of the bills that are before us today, HR 7912, 6799, et cetera, they require the Park Service to submit a report to Congress describing the results of the studies they will undertake. Is there a backlog of these reports right now?
There is. The number is somewhere between 21 and 23 that we're working on. So yes, we're a little bit challenged with that.
Can you give us an expected turnaround time? Give us what would one of these take to finish up? Can they be concurrently worked on? Just a little bit more context around
Yeah,
that.
on the average, a special resource study, we give ourselves about a 3-year window to get them complete. There's one particular one in here that's listed at 18 months that we'd love the opportunity to modify that to be a 3-year window. And then there are a number of steps of people who need to review that and approve it and pass it up to Congress. So they're in various stages of completion right now.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Chair, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair hesitates to recognize the gentleman from Arizona who has worn no tie to this committee hearing, but against his better judgment, he'll recognize Mr. Gallego for 5 minutes.
I'm gonna let that slide, Mr. Chair. Ms. Saul, thank you for your time today. I'm proud to be an original co-sponsor of H.R. 8046, the one that sites included in the bill. The Santa Rita Center is in my district, and incidentally, I actually am very lucky to have a long history with the Chavez family. One of Chavez's grandchildren actually was is my close friend and compadre, and also managed my first state house race. I'm the godfather to the great-grandchild of Cesar Chavez, and Andres Chavez. I don't think you don't see him here, and I are go way back. So it's great to see this happening, and it's something that is very important to the history of Phoenix. And it would be extremely both well received as well. I think a really great way to add more diversity to our park service for people to actually come and see that it's available and history is available to everybody to actually see, especially with the history of the farm worker movement in the Southwest. Could you elaborate on why recognizing Chavez's work is important today, and what will future generations learn by visiting the Cesar Chavez and farm worker movement National Historic Parks?
Thank you for that question, Representative. In looking at the background of the Cesar Chavez, currently the monument that exists in his honor, as well as the sites that are being contemplated for addition, the National Park Service consistently seeks to find those stories within our history that speak to the diversity of the people who make up our society and our American fabric. The reality is that we have spent the last, 10, 20, 30 years of our 100-year organization recognizing that there are many more stories to be told. People who, like Mr. Chavez, have made incredible contributions to changing civil rights, to overcoming atrocities, to bringing new history to new historic stories to the fabric of the stories we tell within the National Park Service. So this particular story, I think, has the opportunity to talk about tenacity, to talk about the rights, the humanity that are needed when we deal with people who perform all kinds of services in our country. And so we certainly support the idea of bringing these types of stories to into a broader audience, to bringing more of a spotlight on them, and being able to help people understand, people of all walks of life, to understand what makes up our America today, that it isn't a singular story or a singular body of people who created our country, but that in fact it's a network of people from all walks of life who helped shape the great country that we are. So.
And what other works is NPS undertaking to ensure that the park system reflects the history and diversity of the United States?
Thank you for the question. I would speak very broadly to the idea that as a senior leader in our organization, we are consistently looking at all of the different stories that we bring from the internal research that we do within our own organization and the subject matter experts that we have who help us find more of that, more of those untold stories. We work with stakeholders. We work with a variety of groups who help to bring forward the stories that they find important that we may not be capturing already. And so we spend a great deal of effort trying to find the most creative, most interesting, most compelling ways to bring those to light and to make them available to the broadest audience possible.
Thank you. Now you'll back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Obernolte for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Hall, thank you very much for the testimony today. I was interested in your written testimony on HR 6720, which would establish the Thomas Paine Memorial in the District of Columbia. You briefly touched on it here in your oral testimony, but you gave more of a history of the issue in your written testimony, which I was interested in. And you pointed out that this memorial, unlike the other memorials in the District of Columbia that are contemplated by other bills today, this memorial was actually previously authorized by Congress in 1992, and then in 1994 they actually authorized a site located in Area 1 in the District of Columbia. So can you walk us through a little bit the history of the original authorization and why that memorial was never built? Because, I mean, obviously that authorization expired in 2003. That's why we're here today, again, looking at reauthorizing it. So I'm interested in the history there. Was there a problem with fundraising, or was it something else?
Thank you for that question, Representative. I wish that I had more details on exactly why that was unable to come to fruition. One of the key parts, of course, is being able to demonstrate fundraising. I do believe that was part of the issue. I don't know if there's a change to the current status of the ability of the organization to now raise funds, but we certainly support the idea of this being looked at by the Memorial Advisory Commission so we can get this back on the agenda, take a look at it, and see if it's prudent to have that established here in the District of Columbia.
Okay. So one of the recommendations that you made for that memorial is that it be reviewed by the National Capital Memorial Advisory Commission, and I understand that it's scheduled to be reviewed the end of this month at their hearing there. And you made a similar recommendation for HR 6611 and 6353 is another memorial that for the service animals that has already been reviewed by the commission. So I have no doubts the commission will find it meritorious, but it's kind of a strange situation where it's not apples and apples, right? This is a memorial that's already been reviewed and approved. So why did you include that recommendation in your testimony?
I appreciate the question. In the discussions with our subject matter experts at the regional level, there have been an entire turnover of the National Memorial Advisory Commission staff. It's been many years. A number of laws have changed. A number of sites have been removed from consideration on the mall because they've been occupied by other memorials. So that process, putting that particular memorial back through the review process, I think will just further help to strengthen the validation of whether that is worthy for inclusion, to make sure that the current members have an opportunity to take a look at it in the scope of the total context of all of the memorials that are being considered at this time, and determine whether that's still appropriate to have that on the mall.
Well, sure. Well, as I said, I have no doubts that they're going to find it meritorious, but it seemed a little odd to me to ask them to go through that same process again. And then last question about that, it's the challenge with these memorials. I mean, obviously there's the legislative hurdle of getting them approved, and then the bureaucratic challenge of having them heard before the commission, and then there's the fundraising challenge of raising the funds, because quite reasonably, when we authorize a memorial like that, we say this is not a taxpayer-funded memorial. This is something that organizations then have to go fundraise for. Yes. It's interesting because this particular memorial, the legislation is worded different than the other two in the District of Columbia today. In 6353, there's an agency that's tasked with raising the money, the National Service Animals Memorials Corporation, and then in 6611, it's the Embassy of France that's tasked with raising them. But 6720 does not task any one entity with the authority to raise that money. Is that unusual? Do you think that needs to be added to the legislation?
That's an excellent question. Because that very sort of, it's a pretty elaborate process for walking through and looking at the variety. There's a number of organizations that need to touch that potential designation. I'd really be happy to take that question back to my organization, have some subject matter experts that have a little bit more detail on whether that's unusual or whether that's happened in the past, so that they could give you the most accurate answer. I don't have that off the top of my head.
Okay, well, that would be helpful, just because we want to set the stage for everyone's success here, and it's always painful to contemplate a memorial that went through all of the different steps and then failed to get built because that last fundraising piece, that hurdle wasn't met.
Absolutely, yes. More than happy to take that back, and we can get you some specific answers on that.
Right, great, thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. I want to thank the gentleman for his thoughtful questions, as always. The chair will now recognize Mr. Gomert for 5 minutes, if he's still with us. All right. That concludes this panel. Thank you, Ms. Hall, for testifying and for appearing today in front of our committee. We appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Thank you for the opportunity.
The chair will now recognize the third panel of witnesses who will proceed to the dais, and I believe we have a few that are joining us virtually as well. As with the first two panels, oral statements are limited to 5 minutes, but your entire statement will be made part of the hearing record. When you begin, the timer will start and it will turn orange when you have 1 minute remaining and red when your time has expired. After your testimony is complete, please remember to mute yourself to avoid any inadvertent background noise, and I'll also allow the entire panel to testify before questioning the witnesses. The chair will now recognize Dr. Robert Brunswick, Professor Emeritus and Research Fellow at one of the finest universities in the United States, the University of Northern Colorado. Dr. Brunswick, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Chair DeGoose and honorable members of the House Subcommittee on National Parks, Forests, and Public Lands. Since I've already been introduced, I'm Bob Brunswick, Professor Emeritus at UNC. I am testifying as an individual in support of the Dearfield Study Act, H.R. 6438, introduced by Congressman Ken Buck and Joe DeGoose in January of this year. I'll keep my remarks brief, but note that I've submitted supporting documents for my testimony to subcommittee staff. Deerfield was one of more than 24 African-American communities and agricultural colonies established from the end of the Civil War through the early 20th century. In common with those other communities, Deerfield reflected an attempt to create a path toward economic, political, and social self-sufficiency and independence in times when opportunities for African Americans were severely constrained and repressed. Oliver Toussaint Jackson, businessman and longtime aide to Colorado governors, initially established the town of Deerfield while promoting eventual creation of a 31 square mile area of homesteaded and privately purchased farms between 1910 and 1930 in northeastern Colorado's High Plains. Jackson based the town and colony on principles of self-sufficiency, hard work, and economic reliance on agriculture, popularized by Booker T. Washington, founder of the Tuskegee Institute. Both town and colony achieved notable success before, during, and shortly after World War I, but faltered and eventually failed due to the onset of the Depression and Dust Bowl. At the height of its success, the colony and town received national attention from the nation's African American community, including multiple Black press articles and in-person visits by the Booker T. Washington family after his passing in 1915. The core area of the former Deerfield town site, subject to the Deerfield Study Act, was acquired by Denver's Black American West Museum and Heritage Center from the late 1980s through the present day. The museum presently owns 90% of that core area today. Deerfield became a National Register of Historic Places district in 1995. It is the subject of a 2012 National Park Service Historic American Landscapes Report, and since 2012 has been the focus of an ongoing program of site preservation and academic research known as the Deerfield Dream Project. Several goal-focused projects have taken place under the Dream Project, coordinated by the Greeley Citizen-Based Deerfield Preservation Committee in partnership with the site's museum owner and several historic preservation nonprofits, university, state, county, and municipal government entities. In 2018, a long-term development framework for the town site, the Deerfield Strategic Preservation Plan, emerged from a Deerfield conference hosted at the University of Northern Colorado. That plan envisioned implementation of a central goal of the Deerfield Study Act, designation of the town site as a National Historic Site, along with conversion of its two standing buildings, the Jackson House and Filling Station, as elements of a site museum consisting of restored historic structures, visitor, education, and research facilities, and locally interpreted surviving derelict structures. To date, more than $1 million of grants and state legislature appropriations have been raised for town site property purchase, protection, building stabilization, and the ongoing research program, the latter which has included 6 seasons of archaeological field studies. The site's 2 fully intact historic buildings are presently under stabilization and their exteriors being restored to historic conditions in accordance with Secretary of the Interior Preservation Standards through a $498,000 National Park Service African American Civil Rights Grant. And that's the end of my testimony.
Thank you, Professor, for testifying today. Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Ms. Carol Stivers, President of the John P. Parker Historical Society. And the chair also welcomes her and notes her contributions to our country, including her son, who serves as a colleague with us in this body. You're recognized, Ms. Stivers.
Opportunity to testify on behalf of the Parker House Study Act that was presented by Brad Winstrup and also co-sponsored by Joyce Beatty of Ohio. So it was both a Republican and Democratic sponsorship. I'm Carol Stivers from the John P. Parker Historical Society in Ripley, Ohio. We're in Brown County, located on the Ohio River, and we're excited to introduce John P. Parker to everyone, tell you about the house and also John P. Parker Historical Society. John P. Parker was an amazing man, born a slave, and he became a model American citizen. Each month, hundreds of visitors come to Ripley to visit the Parker House and other Underground Railroad sites in Ripley, making heritage tourism one of the biggest economic impacts in Ripley's economy, as tourists buy lunch, gas, and shop in our shops. We want heritage tourism to increase. John P. Parker's story is inspiring. The P stands for Percival. He always signed his name using the P, so we try to use it often. John Parker was self-educated, bought his own freedom, became an Underground Railroad conductor and an extractor as he spent time going into Kentucky, bringing out those that wanted to escape. He was an iron molder, and he was a key recruiter of African Americans for the 27th Ohio Volunteer Infantry during the Civil War. Parker was a businessman and inventor, and he held 3 patents before 1900. He was a hero to many. We want the whole country and the world to know about John P. Parker, because the National Park Service is the foremost organization to promote American heroes. We feel that John P. Parker is a perfect fit. We are seeking a resource study by the National Park Service as a next step to becoming a unit of the National Park Service. We already cooperate and work with the National Park Service in several ways. The John P. Parker House was recognized as a National Historic Landmark in 1997. You have to excuse my voice. I've been having trouble with my voice. The John P. Parker House and Museum Reconnaissance Survey was completed in 2018 by the National Park Service on site at the Parker House. The Parker House, through the years, has had several grants from the National Park Service, and our summer history program uses materials from the National Park Service in the Junior Ranger booklets that they put out. We keep in contact with the National Park Service office in Omaha. Most of what we know about John Parker comes from his autobiography, which I brought a copy of it today. Actually, it's been translated in several languages around the world. But he gave interviews in the 1800s about his life. And so if you would read the written testimony that I sent, there's more details about John Parker and the Parker House. The John P. Parker Historical Society Incorporated bought a tumbled-down Parker House in 1995. We spent 8 years working before we were able to open to the public in 2002. We are now debt-free with a nice cushion to help us along. The house is in sound condition, needing no major repairs. We have nice displays, which we try to improve each year. We have a 9-member volunteer board who work tirelessly to make sure visitors have an inspiring experience when they visit the Parker House. We feel that both the Parker House and the National Park Service would benefit if we could become a site of the National Park Service. I hope that you will consider passing this bill of 6977. And I'll be willing to answer any questions that anybody has. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Stivers, and we could hear you well. Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
We'll ask you to relay to your son and our former colleague our best regards. The chair will now recognize Mr. Richard Watkins, Board President of the Lynching Site Project of Memphis, for 5 minutes.
Good day, Chairman Negus, Ranking Member Fulcher, and other esteemed members of the subcommittee. I am Richard Watkins, the Board President of the Lynching Sites Project of Memphis. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to give an oral statement regarding H.R. 7912, Evaluating Lynching Locations for National Park Site Act, a bill put forth by Representative Cohen. This bill aims to evaluate lynching sites within an approximately 100 miles of Memphis, Tennessee, for potential inclusion in the national park system. Lynchings constrain Black Americans' political and social activities in everyday life. Simple acts such as requesting a store receipt or minor transgressions such as speaking disrespectfully were sometimes met with lethal violence. According to the Equal Justice Initiative, over 4,000 Black people were lynched between 1877 and 1950. We know of 236 reported lynchings in Tennessee during that time, with Shelby County leading the way with 20. Between the years of 1851 and 1939, LSP, my organization, has documented 23 lynchings with 35 victims, and we continue researching other probable cases. By some studies, there have been 183 lynching victims in Tennessee within a 100-mile radius of Memphis. We have determined the precise locations of some lynchings in Shelby County and have found the general locations of others. The exact locations of most lynchings are unknown, which makes recognition of their known locations so meaningful. Last year, we conducted a survey to gauge suitability of the L. Persons site for entry into the National Park Service. This work was performed diligently by our members, comprises my written report submitted with this testimony. We found that this site offered a unique opportunity to recognize and commemorate the phenomenon of racial terror lynchings that plagued our country at the turn of the 20th century. Unlike many lynchings which were performed in secret at the hands of small groups, the L. Persons lynching was what we call a spectacle lynching that was known throughout the nation. L. Persons was a laborer accused of killing a white girl. Despite little evidence and being released twice, Persons was arrested and beaten until he falsely confessed. A mob abducted him from police custody, and the local newspapers publicized that his lynching would be the next day and predicted that he would be set on fire. Mr. Persons was lynched on May 22, 1917, to a carnival-like atmosphere where sandwiches and refreshments were sold. As predicted, he was burned alive. Additionally, his body was dismembered by the crowd and his head thrown in the street of a prominent Black neighborhood. Local coroner concluded that his death was from unknown causes at the hands of unknown persons. This lynching had profound effects to our community and throughout the nation. The NAACP's James Weldon Johnson visited the site and wrote about it in the Crisis magazine. He spoke about it as he advocated for the passage of the federal Dyer anti-lynching bill of 1918 and spoke about it at the 1919 National Conference on Lynching. It played a significant part in the founding of the Memphis chapter of the NAACP, which eventually became the South's largest branch. The Jewish Brotherhood in Memphis condemned the atrocity. Some white Tennesseans even formed the Law and Order League to oppose lynching in the site. It even hampered World War I recruiting efforts because Black men in Memphis refused to enlist. More examples are in my written report. This legislation will help shine the light of truth on what happened on sites like the L. Person site. It has been over 100 years since the lynching, but the site remains largely remote and untouched by development. There are 2 concrete substructures marking the location of the former bridge where the lynching happened, and the path of the road is marked by power lines that run along its former course. The National Park Service's Civil Rights in America, a framework for identifying significant sites, recognizes broad themes in civil rights history. Although lynching is recognized in the framework under the criminal justice theme, there are no National Park Service National Historic Landmarks related to racial terror lynchings. This is a missed opportunity. There needs to be an honest telling of what happened on these sites. There are many examples of efforts to obscure this history. Local coroners would rule deaths the result of unknown causes by unknown persons, such as withheld persons, or accidental, like Jesse Lee Bond of Arlington, Tennessee. Some newspapers would provide blow-by-blow and shotgun blast-by-shotgun blast accounts of these killings in articles with no byline and without identifying the perpetrators, such as with the killings of Thomas Moss, Will Stewart, and Calvin McDowell of the grocery store in Memphis. These later killings inspired Ida B. Wells' groundbreaking anti-lynching work. They were friends of hers. These lynching sites, the El Person site in particular, are places that exemplify the tragic events that shaped our country after Reconstruction and well into the 20th century. A fuller understanding and appreciation will be gained by further study, as well as healing. Thank you for your time, and thank you again to my representative, Steve Cohen, for sponsoring this bill.
Thank you, sir. Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Andres Chavez, Executive Director of the Chavez Foundation. We thank you, sir, and you are recognized.
Mr. Chairman, committee members, thank you for inviting us to testify on behalf of H.R. 8046, the Cesar Chavez and Farmworker Movement National Historical Park Act by Representatives Ruiz and Senator Padilla. I'm Andres Chavez, Executive Director of the National Chavez Center, the arm of the Cesar Chavez Foundation dedicated to promoting and preserving my grandfather's legacy across the country. We also own and manage 2 of the 3 historic sites cited in this bill, the 40 acres outside of Delano, California, and the National Chavez Center in Keene, California. The 40 acres is in Delano, where the movement was born. It serves as the headquarters for the United Farm Workers in the 1960s and provide an array of services such as a co-op gas station and a health clinic. The 40 acres is also home to the Agbani Village, a retirement home we built in 1974 for elderly and displaced Filipino farm workers. The 40 acres is where my grandfather conducted his first lengthy public fast in 1968, violence, and his last and longest fast in 1988 over the perils that pesticides pose to farm workers and consumers. The National Chavez Center at Keene, where I grew up and where Cesar Chavez lived and labored his last quarter century, was headquarters for the movement starting in the early 70s when it expanded across the state and the nation. Keene was also where generations of farm worker leaders learned to run their own union and where thousands more passed through over the decades, acquiring invaluable skills and experience. The 187-acre site in Keene, California is also home to the Cesar Chavez National Monument, 398th unit of the National Park Service. The Chavez National Monument on a small part of the Keene grounds has been run since 2012 through a partnership between the National Chavez Center and the National Park Service. That partnership has introduced this important piece of American history to new audiences that would not otherwise learn about the farmworker movement. So many fresh faces from all walks of life and from all around this nation and the world now visit the National Monument and find great meaning and purpose there. The Chavez National Monument is also the first park to ever honor a contemporary Latino figure. So much of the relevance of the National Monument we have witnessed hails from how it helps elevate the conscience and the pride felt by all Americans, especially young people like myself and the dramatically growing population of Latinos, both urban and rural, who see their contributions to America reflected there. My grandfather put it best in his landmark address to the Commonwealth Club of California in 1984. The coming of our movement, he said, quote, sent out a signal to all Hispanics that we were fighting for our dignity, that we were challenging and overcoming injustice, that we were empowering the least educated among us, the poorest among us. The message was clear. It could happen in the fields, it could happen anywhere, in the cities, in the courts, in the city councils, and the state legislators. I didn't really appreciate it at the time, but the coming of our union signaled the start of great changes among Hispanics that are only now beginning to be seen, unquote. So we at the National Chavez Center and the Cesar Chavez Foundation strongly encourage you all to act on H.R. 8046, the Cesar Chavez and Farmworker Movement National Historic Park Act. Thank you for hearing us.
Let me thank all of the witnesses and thank you, Mr. Oh, we have one more witness. Thank you, Mr. Chavez. Certainly, Chairman Grijalva, who's here with me, and myself and the ranking member, we are all grateful for you being here. The chair now recognizes Mr. Randy Newberg, president of On Your Own Adventures, LLC.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, ranking member, and members of the committee. I'm here because public lands are truly an American treasure. My business creates media content that demonstrates the opportunities to enjoy these lands and how to responsibly use these lands. I'm here to give my support to the corrections that will be found in the Film Act. The Film Act will simplify the permitting process. Currently, the process is extensive no matter how small the request. The turnaround times are long, the requirements vary greatly by agency and by office, and predicting if and when a permit will be provided is difficult. Many of the permit officers have explained to me that the regulations for these filming rules are designed for large Hollywood productions with exhaustive scoping requirements. Since there's no exception for the size of the production group, small groups such as mine, 2 to 4 people, are required to follow the same permitting process of larger, impactful productions. This bill will also provide consistency across all administrative agencies. Currently, it is a different permitting process between the U.S. Forest Service, the BLM, the National Park Service, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. It is even a different process across the offices within the same agency, sometimes vastly different. As an example, one Forest Service district grants me a letter of use saying we are minimal impact and no permit is required. Another district a couple miles away on the same forest requires a full permit application and full fee payment. I've filmed on Department of Interior lands where it was on lands managed by both the National Park Service and the BLM. Both agencies are under the same parent group or agency, the Department of Interior. But I needed 2 different permits requiring 2 different applications, 2 different packages of submission, 2 different fees, depending on where I was standing. The Film Act will lessen the agency burden related to permitting activities. Currently, film permits require approval from many people within an office or within an agency. This is burdensome to those staff members, and it results in excessive costs to the agency, especially compared to the fees assessed to small groups like us. These line permit officers are extremely busy. They have much more priority to their work beyond just film permits, especially in a busy summer fire season as we are entering right now. And it's not reasonable to expect these people to make a small film permit request a high priority. I know many of these people. They work hard to get these film permit requests completed, but the current workload priority, along with the complexity and the inconsistency, makes their job far more challenging and results in a loss of resources to the agency. The Film Act will clarify when a film or photography permit is needed. Currently, the agencies are provided discretion to decide when a permit is needed and for what distribution purposes, at what level of distribution, and the answers vary greatly between the agencies and within employees of the same agency. This legislation will clarify that and give guidelines. The Film Act will streamline when multi-agency permits are required. Many of the places where we film and produce content have a mix of Forest Service, BLM, Park Service, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service lands. Currently, we are required to get multiple permits for those projects occurring where a patchwork of land ownership among these agencies is different. Developing a consistent permitting process will make this easier for the agencies, their permit officers, and their law enforcement personnel. As an example, I've had the BLM issue me a permit and give me the talking points of what they wanted me to highlight about the uniqueness of this area. While the adjacent Forest Service lands just 2 feet away, I was denied a permit and was off limits to me and my crew. Currently, there's the case before appeals or under appeal. It's the Price case. It's been brought up earlier. And this case talks about the propriety of charging a fee. It's not the fee that is concerning to me. I've paid my fees. Over the course of doing this for 14 years, I've paid over $200,000 in film permit fees. I'm here supporting this legislation because it will simplify and make consistent the film permit application for small producers like me and many others. From this bill will come directive, and it will allow for the consistency and ease the burden placed upon the administrative people within the agencies responsible for permits. Thank you for consideration of this legislation. Thank you for allowing me to testify. I've provided written testimony to all of you, and I'm happy to answer any questions of the committee.
Gentleman yields back. Thank you for your testimony. Thank you to all the witnesses for their valuable testimony. Reminding the members that Committee Rule 3, subparagraph D, imposes a 5-minute limit on questions. The chair will now recognize members for any questions they may wish to ask the witnesses. And with that, I will start with recognizing Mr. Tonko from New York for 5 minutes, if he is still with us.
I am, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the entire panel of witnesses for joining us and sharing your expertise. I'm proud to represent the Capital Region of New York, where I've seen the incredible strength, the healing, and the possibility that comes from commemorating our shared histories. We are fortunate to have several national heritage areas that instill a strong sense of place in our communities and provide individuals with a place to gather and reflect on their shared histories. Many times those histories challenge us to grow and become stronger and more forceful and more just in our outcome. Mr. Watkins, why is the sense of place for lynching locations in particular so meaningful?
Well, the place is so meaningful because of time. These locations are not well known. I was born and raised here in Memphis, Tennessee, and I knew that lynchings existed, but did not know of any of the ones that occurred in and around our area. They're important to be recognized now because of future development that could happen. For instance, with the El Persons site right now, it's relatively untouched, but it is surrounded by development. And we are humans, we're people, we like to develop things. It is only a matter of time before such sites are, paved over or are erased. Another example, of course, is the site of the People's Grocery Store lynching, where these 3 individuals were murdered and killed on the banks of the Mississippi River. Right now, there's a very successful brewery right next to the location. The actual precise location is not known, but in that area right next to this brewery is still undeveloped. But again, if there's a brewery there, it's only a matter of time before a luxury condo or something else goes up, and that location will then be unknown.
Well,
Go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to say, the National Park Service is a space-based organization, and being on the actual sites of these things means a lot, and it goes a long way in helping our community heal as well as the nation heal.
So in a way, I was going to ask you what the risk is if we fail to preserve the cultural resources that contain the history of lynching in America. And you began to address that. Anything you want to add to that risk if we fail?
Well, if we fail, again, there's so many sites that are unknown as of right now. And if we preserve and recognize the current sites, it could we strongly believe that it will spur further efforts to find those sites that are now unknown, so that we can also recognize those in other separate communities so that they can heal in their own way.
And heal and learn from our history. And how do you believe, Mr. Watkins, that the L. Persons lynching site and others would benefit from National Park Service management?
Well, I believe with management, of course, comes resources, in which case the site will be preserved. People will be drawn to that area to learn more. Memphis has a long history in civil rights. These areas, the locations within Memphis, would draw even more people to learn about what happened on these sites and learn how it shaped American history.
And having the National Park Service management.
So with the National Park Service management, it elevates the stature of those sites and even more.
The stature of those sites.
Exactly. It shows that it adds to the recognition that this site is recognized as being important on a federal and national level, and not just in that neighborhood or in that city, but on a national level. It means that we as a nation are starting to come to terms with these wrongs.
Thank you. I think we have such an opportunity with this National Heritage Area Program, Mr. Chair, to accomplish a multitude of tasks and respond to a cleansing, if you will, and to make certain that we learn from this history and that we as a nation have an opportunity to heal as we advance a program that has been tremendously impacting as a National Heritage Area concept. So with all of that being said, I appreciate all of our witnesses today. You're informing us and encouraging us and challenging us in a way to really commit to a concept that can really not only be an economic development tool, but an additive that really affects our thinking and, again, enhances a healing here. So thank you so much. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and certainly thank the gentleman for his leadership on the National Heritage Area reauthorization. The chair will now recognize Mr. Fulcher for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And good panels today. Just thank you for the organization of that. And Mr. Chairman, I don't have questions for Ms. Stivers, but I do want to just make a comment. Anyone that knows me well knows that if they really want to get my attention or need to persuade what I do, they talk to my mother. And there's an understanding that you might be related to a certain Mr. Stivers that we used to serve with. Sometimes we need to try to influence just a little bit. And so this is serving notice that your contact is now made, okay? And so for all of us here on the committee, you may be getting some phone calls, and appreciate you being here. Thank you for your testimony, and thank you for your work. Very worthy effort, and just you're appreciated very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'd like to shift gears and go to Mr. Newberg, please, for some questions. Mr. Newberg, it was interesting hearing your testimony and some of the nuances of what you have faced, but according to data from the U.S. Department of Commerce, the outdoor recreation economy accounted for 1.8%, or about $374.3 billion of current dollar GDP for our country in 2020. Would you just talk a little bit about how the Film Act could grow the outdoor recreation economy even further by promoting activity on our federal lands?
Yes, thank you, Representative Fulcher. As you know, in Idaho and where I live in Montana, a lot of this activity occurs in rural areas where these public lands and the economy around them are extremely important. The Film Act would, I guess, I'd call it, make it easier to comply with all the rules and regulations about promoting these opportunities. These are American treasures, as I said, and our outdoor economy is extremely important to the Rocky Mountain states and any place where public land exists. So I think being able to promote these, know that you're complying, giving people the freedom to talk about these amazing places and build advocacy for these places will definitely be helpful to that economy.
Thank you for that. And outdoor activities such as hunting and fishing and things that you have promoted for your lifetime are such rich American pastimes. It's more important than ever we share this heritage with the next generation of Americans. Mr. Newberg, do you believe the Film Act may be a avenue to get the younger generations excited again and stimulate more activity in those areas?
Yes, I do, sir. My age, we did a lot of print magazines. That's our form of communication. That's what got me started in it. In today's world, it is video. It is digital content, digital media that the younger people watch and follow. And the Film Act would make it much easier for us to create content that emphasizes the importance of these lands, emphasizes the history, and also how to use these lands in a responsible manner.
You had mentioned during your testimony, or at least touched on this, how the Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, and Fish and Wildlife Service, as well as the Park Service, all have different but somewhat laborious film permitting processes that often vary across offices or units within that same agency. What are some of those inconsistencies among the federal agencies for film permitting?
I see we don't have but more than a minute. I could spend an hour. A lot of that would be where you're allowed to go, what times you're allowed to do it, where your camping restrictions will be, how much you submit as an operating plan, what the fee structure will be, any seasonality to it, the bonding and surety requirements. But most often it's just whether or not you can get a permit for certain parts and whether you won't, and to what degree the permit is required, or will they just give you a letter of use? You never know until you've talked to these really good employees who are working hard. But the regulations just make it very, very difficult for them to be consistent across not just the agencies, but across all the federal agencies.
Has that been a drain on your staff, on your resources, the permitting?
Yeah, we're small. We have 10 employees and we probably have one employee full-time, anywhere from 6 to 8 weeks just doing film permits.
Thank you, Mr. Newberg. And to all the panelists, thank you for your time. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. We are going to go a bit out of order with my sincere apologies to my friend from California. A member is going to join us, Mr. Keating, who has a bill before the committee today, who was unable to join us during the member testimony panel. Mr. Keating, if you are available, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Chairman Neguse and Ranking Member Fulcher. I'm coming before you today as Chair of the Subcommittee on Europe and Foreign Affairs and Co-Chair of the French Caucus, joined with a similar Senate bill with Senator Coons in the Senate in support of H.R. 6611, which is a bill to authorize the Embassy of France in Washington, D.C. to establish commemorative work in the D.C. area and its environs to honor the extraordinary contributions of Jean Monnet to restoring peace between European nations and establishing the European Union. There's no more important time, perhaps since World War II, than right now to recognize this kind of achievement. As a French diplomat and businessman, Jean Monnet was a dedicated citizen of Europe, a patriot of his native France, a devoted friend, importantly, of the United States. He played a crucial role in many of the key global events and efforts of the 20th century, including both world wars, the League of Nations, the rebuilding of Europe, and importantly, founding the European Union. I believe in creating a commemorative work honoring Jean Monnet in the capital region as his extraordinary role in promoting cooperation and peace on both sides of the Atlantic has not only furthered the national interest of the United States, but also of lasting historical significance to the American people. During World War II, Jean Monnet contributed to the war efforts. His work was essential to the U.S. and Allied victory over Nazi Germany. After the occupation of France in early part of the war, Jean Monnet moved to Washington, D.C. as a member of the British Purchasing Commission. He worked with senior U.S. officials to pool Allied resources, galvanize U.S. war production, and unleash the arsenal of democracy, a phrase coined by Monnet and later made famous by President Roosevelt. Along with his role in war production, Jean Monnet served as an advisor to the U.S. President and a special envoy of the United States to free France. When asked about Jean Monnet's work during World War II, U.S. Supreme Court Justice and trusted presidential advisor Felix Frankfurter stated, "Monnet has been a creative and energizing force in the development of our defense program." After the cessation of hostilities, the influential economist John Maynard Keynes concluded that Jean Monnet's contribution shortened the global conflict by an entire year. There's no doubt his actions served tens of thousands of us here in America and European and saved that amount of lives, actually. Additionally, Jean Monnet helped found the European Union, the United States' trusted ally and largest bilateral trade and investment partner. Having seen firsthand the benefits of working together in both World War I and World War II, Jean Monnet continued to advocate for increased cooperation in Europe. He proposed the creation of the European Coal and Steel Community, which pooled the coal and steel resources of 6 countries and established the economic bonds between the nations at war during those early years. He organized the Action Committee for the United States of Europe, a platform for political parties from European countries to advocate for further integration between European nations. Both the ECSC and the Action Committee were crucial steps in forming the European Union that we know today. Monet envisioned an enduring friendship for the United States and Europe. He remarked in 1961 that the partnership of Europe and the United States should create a new force for peace. With shared common interests and values, the United States and the EU have worked collaboratively in the spirit of Jean Monnet, building a trade relationship, investing in humanitarian aid, supporting the spread of free market and democratic reforms. And look what they're doing today, working together with us to deal with the threat of Russia and Ukraine. For his contributions to the U.S. national interest and global community, President Lyndon Johnson awarded Jean Monnet the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1963. The award was conferred with distinction. Jean Monnet is one of only 26 individuals to receive this award. The award citation noted that Monnet helped coordinate Anglo-American efforts in planning during World War II, and his practical wisdom and persuasive energies on behalf of the European Union and his close cooperation between Europe and the United States have been a great resource for the freedoms we enjoy today. Succeeding generations have built upon the foundations of diplomacy, which Monnet and his contemporaries laid. European Union, which Monnet helped create, has been a steadfast and trusted partner of the United States. And since Monet's passing in 1979, Europe and transatlantic cooperation has spread across the continent, with the European Union welcoming 19 additional members and NATO welcoming 15, soon to be 17 members. Today, Europe, the United States, and the world are once again challenged with a conflict we haven't seen, the scope of which we haven't seen since World War II. However, transatlantic partnership and the European Union are stronger than ever, thanks to the cooperation inspired by Jean Monnet. So the addition of a commemorative work honoring Monnet in our nation's capital will only honor his incredible achievements, but it'll also remind us of the historic and continuing significance of the transatlantic partnership between the United States, France, and the greater European community. I'm sorry to be lengthy with that, but part of this testimony is to really reinforce the historical significance, not just of Monnet in France, but also with the United States in our country, and the importance of his work that undoubtedly helped shorten the war, helped save American lives, and built a lasting reinforcement for the preservation of democracy and freedom. So with that, I yield back, and thank you for the opportunity.
Gentleman yields back. Thank you, Mr. Keating, for your testimony and for presenting this incredibly important bill. The chair will now recognize Mr. Obernolte for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a couple of questions for Ms. Stivers. Ms. Stivers, thank you very much for being here. I know it's a long trip from Ohio, but I'm of the opinion that we communicate a lot more clearly and we can emote more when we're face to face. And I want you to know personally how much I appreciate you making the effort.
Thank you.
I was really moved by your written testimony, and your oral testimony focused on the story of John P. Parker and the reasons for wanting to establish the John P. Parker House as a unit of the National Park System. But I kind of regret that you didn't go into the history of your efforts to acquire the house and the property, because I found it truly inspirational. I was amazed to find that it's been since 1966 that the Historical Society has been trying to acquire this property, and the story of how the members of the society made personal loans to make that possible, about how you still only have one paid employee, about how it's all volunteer. It's just an amazing story. So thank you for your passion on that. So in your testimony, you talked about heritage tourism a little bit, and I know that this has been kind of a journey for you, where you started out as a National Historic Landmark, and then later you pursued being a Network to Freedom site, and now this would be the next step. Can you talk about how those first two steps helped to increase heritage tourism at the house?
Well, getting the word out is the key to tourism, and our tourism has increased. Of course, during COVID, we did take a hit, but we're pretty good with our history is important, and John P. Parker really is a role model. And lately, we just had a lady who came to our site, and she had written a book because she's a biracial marriage, and she was looking for someone to have a role model for her son. So she's written a whole book about the experiences of John Parker after reading his book. And he's also written up in lots of other books. And he is a role model, and that's the thing that we want to push. And the heritage tourism continues to grow. We have big buses. In fact, today, we have the docent, but we help as volunteers while he's on the floor explaining things. Sometimes we take care of the cash register for the gift shop and things. And we have a 50-person tour today, and we only have about 50 chairs, so it takes all of us to work. But anyway, the heritage tourism is a big thing. We also have the river, and that's a big draw to Ripley. So, and we have Rankin House, which is important, which in my written testimony, I hope you'll read that. And also I referred you to something, a YouTube presentation called John Parker in His Own Words. I hope you'll look at that because it's very impressive. It was done by Anthony Gibbs, who's a reenactor connected with the Ohio Historical Society, and he does an excellent job. He sometimes comes to our site and impersonates John Parker, but we feel that he's a role model, and as our tourism increases, it also helps Ripley's businesses, as I said. And heritage tourism is a big push, and we all need things for economic development.
Right. Well, I'm going to start by reading the book. Actually, I've been up here, I went on Amazon and bought it. So
thank you very much.
I was not familiar with the story, but it's fascinated me. So, should we take this next step here, and should the study be successful and the house be made a unit of the national park system? How do you anticipate that would increase heritage tourism? What are the next steps for the site?
Well, of course, the National Park Service is the epitome of tourism, and everybody wants to go to the National Park Service sites, and it would increase our popularity and letting people know about John Parker and the site in Ripley. And also in my written testimony, I told about the Freedom Center in Cincinnati. They have a video presentation called Brothers of the Borderland, which features John Parker and John Rankin. So anytime we can get the word out, and if we were a site of the National Park Service, I think it would elevate our story and people would know more about us and more people would come.
Well, you've certainly inspired me. I'm going to ask Mr. Wenstrup if I can be a co-sponsor on that bill because I think it's a very logical next step. And thank you again for being here. You know, it's reading your testimony, I was reminded of that famous Margaret Mead quote from over 50 years ago when she said, "Never doubt the power of a small, committed group of people to change the world." And that's what your group is doing. So thank you for your passion and your
commitment. Thank you. Well, we've had some dedicated members. And as I said, when in my written testimony, I told that the 3 banks were locally owned at that time. They were not big banks from other places. And so they each loaned us $30,000 to pay. And it was an unsecured loan, but their examiners didn't like that at all. And so we had one bank who kept buying up the loans from other banks till we got it paid off. So, but anyway, we've been successful in our fundraising. And actually, we have a reserve, which is very nice, too.
Well, thank you for being here today and keep up the good work.
Thank you very much.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back. Are there any other members who wish to be heard and ask the questions and ask the witnesses any questions today? Hearing none, let me just say to each of the witnesses how much I appreciate, Mr. Obernolte said it well, your participation, both in person and virtually. We've had a lot of hearings in the subcommittee over the course of the last year. We have our staff kind of tabulating the numbers, and I rarely get an opportunity to thank the staff, both my staff in my office and the subcommittee staff, as well as the minority staff for their hard work in assembling all the materials required to consider all of these bills. But this is definitely a working committee of all the committees in the Congress. We take our obligations seriously, and it's why we're able to consider such a high volume of bills from both Republican and Democratic members. I want to say, particularly to these witnesses, thank you, because many of you are volunteers. We recognize that you're devoting your time, your effort, in some cases personal expenses, towards preserving these incredibly important parts of American history. And I, for one, am very grateful. And having been chair of this committee now for, I guess, going into the second year here, about a year and a half, it's been incredibly enlightening for me as I learn more about all of the various places in our wonderful country that we have endeavored over the course of the last several centuries to conserve, to save, to preserve. And it is a byproduct of not only the actions taken by the public servants who serve in this body, but by the citizens like yourselves, professors, nonprofit leaders, advocates, teachers, folks who have decided that there are pieces of American history that are worth preserving. And I, for one, am very grateful. There's a quote from one of our country's greatest presidents, the first president of the United States, George Washington, that I've often come back to, which is that a primary object should be the education of our youth in the science of government. In a republic, what knowledge can be equally important, and what duty more pressing than communicating it to those who are to be the future guardians of the liberties of the country. And I think President Washington said it so well. And as I reflect on all of the various pieces of legislation that this committee has considered today and over the course of the last 2 years, I certainly think that we're meeting that mandate that the President Washington set out for us some 230 some odd years ago. So with that, I thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony, the members for their questions. The members of this committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we'll ask you to respond to those in writing. Under Committee Rule 3, subparagraph O, members of the committee must submit witness questions within 3 business days following the hearing, and the hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for these responses. If there is no further business, without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.